2 weeks ago, I showed you the arithmetic of Canada's surrender. 420 billion in exports flow south, 27 billion in new markets by 2030 if everything breaks right. I told you Carney would sign a framework deal by August, and I told you what it would cost. 20 to 30 billion dollars every year, forever. On February 2nd, three of Canada's largest banks, Scotiabank, CIBC, and TD, publicly announced support for something called the Defense, Security, and Resilience Bank, or DSRB for short. There is your mechanism, right in front of you, in the open. The Defense, Security, and Resilience Bank. Sounds responsible, doesn't it? Sounds like adults making difficult choices in dangerous times. Here's what it actually is. It's the payment plan for a protection racket you did not agree to join. Right now, Canada spends 1.4% of GDP on defense. That's $35 billion a year. NATO wants 2%. Trump wants 3%. The compromise Carney will sign because he has to sign something lands around 2.5%. That's 60 to 65 billion annually. 25 to 30 billion in new spending every year, starting 2027. Now here's the fun part.
Well, obviously we'll have to raise taxes. Problem solved. Why are you being so dramatic?
Perfect. Let's do the math. A 10% increase in federal income tax generates about 18 billion. That's not enough. And good luck selling that to Canadians already paying 40 to 50% marginal rates.
Fine. Borrow it. That's what governments do.
Also a solid plan. Canadian federal debt sits at 1.2 trillion. Debt to GDP ratio 42%. That means Canada has to pay a debt of $42 for every $100 its economy earns. Add 30 billion per year in new structural spending. In 10 years, you're looking at debt to GDP pushing 60% or higher. Credit rating agencies start making uncomfortable noises around 55. When your rating drops, borrowing costs spike. Then you're paying more interest on the debt you took to pay for the defense spending you did not want. It's a beautiful trap, really, almost elegant.
So what's your solution? Just let Putin walk into Poland?
I appreciate the commitment to the hypothetical invasion, but here is a structural question. If we need 30 billion more to stop Putin from walking into Poland, what were we spending the first 35 billion on? Expensive napkins? Let's talk about where the money actually comes from, because it has to come from somewhere. Federal budget breakdown, rough numbers. Healthcare transfers to provinces, 80 billion per year. Social services and income support, 60 billion. Infrastructure, 40 billion. Education and training, 35 billion. You need 25 to 30 more billion. Where do you cut?
Easy. Cut waste and inefficiency. Every government has tons of that.
Fantastic idea. Show me the line item. Seriously, I'll wait. Because every politician in history has promised to cut waste and inefficiency. It's the free money fairy tale of public finance, and yet somehow the waste is never found in amounts larger than a rounding error. You know why? Because 80% of government spending is wages, transfers, and debt service. You can't efficiency your way out of structural math. So let's get real. Healthcare funding gets frozen. Not cut. That's too obvious. Just frozen. Which means, in real terms, adjusted for inflation and population growth, it shrinks by 2 to 3% per year. Over 5 years, that's a 10 to 15% reduction in effective healthcare capacity. Here's what that looks like on the ground. Ontario, wait from referral to treatment, 19.2 weeks. That's nearly 5 months. Quebec, 32 weeks. British Columbia, 32 weeks. This is the baseline reality before any new defense financing vehicles kick in. And when healthcare funding gets adjusted to make room for DSRB obligations, these numbers don't shrink, they grow. But hey, at least we'll have the military capacity to defend a healthcare system we can't access. That's called irony, or possibly just math. So this is where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean structurally revealing. Ontario government announced it's ready to support DSRB headquarters in Toronto. Great. How? By potentially leveraging $5 billion through provincial pension assets. Let's unpack that sentence. Potentially. That's a word that means we haven't actually decided, but we're signaling willingness. Leveraging. That's a word that means using as collateral to borrow more because we don't have enough. Pension assets? That's a phrase that means money that belongs to Ontario public sector workers for their retirement. So just to be clear, the plan is to use teachers' pensions and nurse pensions as collateral to borrow money that will fund a bank that will then lend money to defense contractors. And this is being sold as economic development.
But the bank is owned by participating governments. It's not a private scheme.
You're right. It's owned by participating governments and partnered with commercial banks. Which banks? Scotiabank, CIBC, and TD. Plus, according to Reuters, major global banks. What do these partner banks do? According to the press releases, provide low-cost financing, credit guarantees, and procurement support. To whom? Defense contractors. Let me name them for you. CAE, Training and Simulation. General Dynamics Land System Canada in London, Ontario, Armored Vehicles. General Dynamics Mission Systems Canada in Ottawa, Command, Control, Communication, Computers, Intelligence, Surveillance, Reconnaissance. L3 Harris Technologies Canada, Sensors and Communications. Irving Shipbuildings, Seaspan Shipyards. Davy, Lockheed Martin Canada, Raytheon Canada. And if you want a smoking gun, General Dynamics Ordnance and Tactical Systems in Valleyfield was the largest Canadian supplier to the U.S. Department of Defense in fiscal year 2024. These are the beneficiaries. Where does the money come from? Pension funds plus federal borrowing. Where does the profit go? To the defense primes through contracts, to the partner banks through underwriting fees, syndicated loan fees, interest rate spreads, and advisory fees. Who takes the risk if something goes wrong? Canadian taxpayers. This isn't a partnership. This is outsourced extraction with a government guarantee.
Oh, sure, everything is a conspiracy. Next, you'll tell me the banks are run by lizard people.
No lizards required, just incentives. Banks do what banks do. They intermediate capital and take a cut. That's not sinister, it's just their business model. The question isn't whether banks are evil. The question is whether this structure serves Canadian interests or just makes extraction more efficient. And listen, I want to be fair here. If someone can show me how borrowing against pension funds to finance defense procurement creates long-term value for the people whose pensions are being leveraged, I'm genuinely open to hearing it. I just haven't seen the math yet. If you're following this and thinking, wait, there is more to this story than I'm seeing in mainstream coverage, you're right. Subscribe now. This channel exists to map power as it actually moves, not as we are told it moves. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because this doesn't hit every province the same way. Ontario turns defense spending into payroll. London builds the armored vehicles. Ottawa Corridor builds the command and control systems, the electronics, the cyber infrastructure. Southwestern Ontario manufacturing sprawl absorbs supplier contracts. Ontario's leverage is factories. Alberta's leverage is energy and geography, Arctic logistics, strategic fuel supply. But Alberta doesn't get General Dynamics plants. It gets procurement invoices and sustainable contracts. Same system, different role. One province manufactures, the other province pays and supplies. And both get told it's about national security.
But isn't this just how federations work? Different regions contribute different things?
Sure, except when the contribution is mandatory, the extraction is permanent and the benefit distribution is wildly asymmetric. Let's zoom out further, because this pattern has precedent. The United States doesn't always annex territories. Sometimes it builds a security economy around you. Bases, procurement networks, supply chain integration, financing structures, regulatory harmonization. You keep the flag. You lose degrees of freedom. South Korea got industrial takeoff inside the security umbrella, became a manufacturing powerhouse, but operates within US alliance security architecture. The Philippines got strategic hosting inside the umbrella. Bases, transit rights, defense cooperation agreements, less industrial capture, more dependency dynamics. Canada is being nudged toward a hybrid. Host nation plus selective industrial capture. Ontario gets the plants and the paychecks. Alberta supplies the energy and logistics. Montreal or Toronto host the money pipes. Healthcare stays on rationing logic because it's politically messy. Defense gets institutionalized because it's geopolitically urgent. Different tiers, different rules. This is the trick. Defense finance turns war into an infrastructure asset class. Pension funds become collateral. Contractors become beneficiaries. Taxpayers become guarantors. And somehow this gets branded as partnership. Let's talk about the actual threat assessment. Because if we're spending 30 billion more per year, presumably there is a proportional increase in security, right? Russia's military budget, 75 billion per year. China, 230 billion. NATO combined, excluding the United States, 350 billion. After these increases, 450 to 500 billion. United States alone, 850 billion. So here is my question. If the US plus NATO already outspend Russia and China combined by roughly 2 to 1, what exactly does Canada's extra 30 billion accomplish? Does it change the strategic balance? Or does it just demonstrate compliance? I'm genuinely asking. Because if it's the former, great. Show me the scenario where Canadian defense spending at 2.5% of GDP instead of 1.4% prevents a war. I'd love to see that analysis. But if it's the latter, if this is just about signaling alignment, then maybe we should be honest about that. Because compliance has a price. And Canadians are going to pay it. Not through taxes, as it turns out. Through healthcare wait times measured in months, not days. Through crumbling infrastructure deferred for another decade. Through pension funds that somehow never have enough money when it's time to retire. But at least NATO will be pleased. So what happens next? Let me walk you through the timeline. Carney signs a framework agreement with the United States by August 2026. I showed you that math 2 weeks ago. The leverage is too asymmetric for any other outcome. DSRB becomes operational by end of 2026. Defense spending increases begin in fiscal year 2027. Federal budget for 2027 announces temporary healthcare funding adjustment to ensure fiscal sustainability. That's the language they will use, not cuts. adjustments. Provincial transfer payments get frozen or reduced by 5 to 10%. Pension contribution rates for federal employees increase starting 2028. Defense procurement contracts start flowing to the named beneficiaries. CAE gets simulation contracts. GDLS London gets vehicle sustainment deals. Irving gets naval construction extensions. The partner banks collect their fees. And somewhere around 2029 or 2030, Canadians wake up and realize they're living in a country where wait times for surgery have increased by 40%. University tuition went up 25% because education funding got squeezed. Infrastructure is crumbling faster than before because maintenance budgets got deferred. But military spending is at 2.5% of GDP. Mission accomplished. And it will be called, I promise you, a successful negotiation that preserved Canadian sovereignty while meeting alliance commitments. Well, the detractors will, of course, say,
Okay, so what are we supposed to do about it? You were just being negative.
fair criticism. Here's what you can do. Understand the trade-off. When your provincial government announces healthcare funding adjustments, know why. When your pension fund announces portfolio rebalancing towards strategic sectors, know what that means. When you're waiting not weeks but months for a medical procedure, remember this video. And maybe, just maybe, when the next election comes, ask your candidates one simple question. How much of my healthcare are you willing to trade for NATO compliance? See what they say. I'm curious. If you find this analysis useful, subscribe now, because DSRB is only the first mechanism. Arctic Sentry implementation come next. And that arithmetic is even more brutal. NATO announced it has begun military planning for something called Arctic Sentry. Details remain classified, but here is what we know so far. It involves infrastructure development, supply chain resilience, and integrated defense capabilities in the Canadian Arctic. Infrastructure development. Who pays for that? Supply chain resilience. Who finances that? Integrated defense capabilities. Who funds that? 3 guesses. First 2 actually don't count. Next week, we map the Arctic extraction mechanism. The leverage is even more asymmetric than you think. This is Eagle's View, and that's a wrap for today. I'll see you next week.